we kind of did some research, and ground can be 30 degrees cooler when it has water underneath it than the ground around it. So that can make a big temperature change. And it's just as simple as saying, hey, look at your dog in your backyard. How often does he dig down, to get to different ground temperature, clay, mud, stuff like that. So the attractiveness is to when it's hot and when the buck needs that coolness up against his body, because remember, they cannot regulate their body temperature. So there's different factors that we're looking at with temperature inside these bedding areas to help them get that regulation that they need for that day.
Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast, episode number 246. Joshua Franks, Tactical Cyber Scouting and Mature Buck Bedding Temperature. Support for the Big Buck Registry and the Deer Hunt Podcast comes from Hunter's Blend Coffee. Awaken your hunt with coffee purchased directly from farmers around the world, creating jobs and alleviating poverty. Hunter's Blend Coffee, we're hunters too. Polar Works Coolers and the Chill Zone, specializing in the most durable, reliable thermal cups and coolers. Keep your drinks hot or cold in any element. Black Ash Outdoor Products reduce your risk of tree stand suspension trauma with a Tree Stand Wingman, the Tree Stand Emergency Descender System. Covert Scouting Cameras, remote cameras for hunting, wildlife, and security. Morse's Sporting Goods, a full line of sporting goods without the sales tax. And Big Buck merch. You can get cool, high-quality Big Buck t-shirts, long-sleeve t-shirts, and hoodies. And show support for this podcast by visiting www.bigbuckregistry.com/MERCH. Big Buck Registry is a virtual museum of hunting stories. We preserve a piece of Americana by interviewing and recording hunters about their hunts and experiences from across the country. And who knows, maybe we'll learn a thing or two along the way that'll help us take our hunt to the next level.
I'm Fred Eichler, and you're listening to my favorite podcast on iTunes, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
I'm Jim Shockey, and you're about to listen to my favorite podcast, Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Good evening, this is Matt Goodlife from across the pond. I'm a passionate deer hunter, and you're listening to one of my favourite deer hunting podcasts in the world, the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, fellow predators. My name is Jay, and thank you for tuning in to the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. For Dusty Phillips and Jim Keller and the entire staff here at the Big Buck Registry, welcome to this week's show. There are a couple things I'd like you to do for us if you could. If you would, please check us out on iTunes, subscribe, and leave us a review. With your help, we're going to try and push this show up the iTunes charts. I know we have a lot of listeners out there, and I need you to take some action. I need you to leave a review and subscribe to the show. If you do subscribe, that'll give you access and notification each and every week that a new show is released. You can also access this show in its entirety on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. It's all right there for you to access on demand at your fingertips. Regarding the harness program, we have an ample supply of harnesses to give away from our volunteer donors. If you're in need of a full body harness, please send an email to jay@bigbuckregistry.com. We continue our talks with the Pressured Deer Pros and Bill Vale Circle of Masters. This time we explore tactical cyber scouting and mature buck bedding temperatures with Joshua Franks. Josh uses readily available internet satellite images to study land, terrain, cover, and topography. He also uses this information to determine bedding areas, food plot, and stand locations. Josh heavily focuses his studies in mature buck bedding temperature and has recently co-authored a book about the subject with Bill Vale. Josh uses temperature to determine where and why to hunt certain areas on certain days. We'll turn to our entire interview with Joshua Franks in just a minute, but first let's hear from our friends over at Polar Works and then Jim Keller with the Deer News. Folks, I want to tell you about one of the best coolers I found for the price in quite a while. I was with my family the other day and I couldn't believe the price on the cooler I was looking at. I always wanted one of those high-end coolers because of the quality that I had heard of, but I couldn't justify the price. Then I found Polar Works. Finally, I found a company that understands quality and affordability. What do I love about these coolers? Well, for one, the ice stays frozen for a long period of time. But they've thought of other things in their design. For example, drain speed. No one likes a slow drain after a long weekend on the trail. And there's the non-slip Polar Feet. Polar Feet will prevent sudden movement when you're on the move. There's the sweat-free material, so you don't have to worry about cleaning up puddles when you're finished with your journey. Polar tubs hold ice for such a long period of time because of the 3-inch insulated walls, the heavy-duty gaskets, and the fail-proof hinges, which guarantee a freezer-tight seal. So check out polarworks.com when you're considering your next high-quality cooler without breaking the bank. That's www.polarwerkz.com.
For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News. Our first story this week: elk from extreme southwestern Montana exposed to brucellosis. This story is from the OutdoorNews.com website. State wildlife and livestock officials say an elk captured in the Tendoy Mountains in southwestern Montana tested positive for exposure to brucellosis. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention defines brucellosis as an infectious disease caused by bacteria. People can get the disease when they are in contact with infected animals or contaminated animal products. The animals that are most commonly infected include sheep, cattle, pigs, and dogs, among others. Symptoms include fever, sweats, headache, pain in muscles, joints, or back, as well as fatigue. The Montana Department of Livestock said this is the first time a positive test has been found in the mountains southwest of Dillon, which is outside the area where ranchers are required to test livestock for brucellosis. The bacterial disease can cause cattle, bison, and elk to abort or have weak offspring. The Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks says 100 elk were sampled. 30 elk were fitted with radio collars to study their movements and understand how the disease may spread. State veterinarian Marty Zalewski says finding an exposed elk in the Tendoys emphasizes the importance of elk surveillance near the boundary of the designated sampling area. U.S. gun giant Remington files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This story is from the Outdoor Hub website. Due to mounting debts, one of the U.S.'s largest firearm manufacturer, Remington Outdoor, has officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. Remington, which The Guardian reports is a 202-year-old company, made the official filing. Going off what we already know, the company plans to transfer control of the firm to its creditors in an effort to reduce its debts. Remington has said it has debts ranging from $100 million to $500 million. This news is a continuation of the struggles gunmakers faced since Donald Trump, the man who calls himself a true friend of the industry, was elected as president. The announcement also comes after the banking firm Citigroup said it would no longer approve of its business customers to sell firearms to anyone under 21 years old or anyone who hasn't passed a sufficient background check. Texas chronic wasting disease containment area extended for next hunting season. This story is from the News Channel 10 website and was reported by Christy Gerlett. The chronic wasting disease containment area in the northwestern part of the Texas Panhandle has been extended east in between Dalhart and Hartley. The Texas Park and Wildlife Department made this expansion last week due to a positive CWD deer found dead on the side of the road in the area this past January. In 2017, there were 7 cases of CWD found in western Dallam and Hartley counties. There have not been any cases of deer transmitting the disease to humans or evidence that eating meat from CWD-positive deer would mean infection, but containment areas are set up by the Texas Park and Wildlife Departments as a precaution to monitor if this disease is spreading amongst the deer. To see the new containment area and surveillance area, please check out the map on newschannel10.com. Chef taunted vegan protesters by butchering a deer in front of them. This story is from the Vice.com website. A Toronto chef, exasperated with some vegan activists protesting outside of his restaurant, decided to fire back in a rather unique way. A small group of vegans gathered outside of the Antler Kitchen and Bar, a West End Toronto restaurant, with a banner and cameras to protest the eating and butchering of meat this weekend. The vegans have been protesting there regularly, and the Antler has responded with a few stunts. This time, though, much to the vegan's chagrin, Michael Hunter, the restaurant chef who specializes in wild game meat, upped his game by hauling a leg of a deer out to the window and started carving it up in front of the protesters. Police, there to oversee the protest, went in to talk to Hunter during this, but decided that, hell, since it's his restaurant, he can do what he likes. In a video provided to Unilad, you can hear the protesters were not too pleased. He's doing it deliberately to mock and taunt us because we're vegans, said the man behind the camera. As you can see, the owner has brought the leg of a recently murdered animal to the front of the restaurant to taunt the activists. From here, Hunter didn't really pay any heed to the protesters. He just butchered part of the deer, cutting off a good-sized hunk of meat. The chef then took this meat and headed to the back of his restaurant. When he returned to the window, he had a big plate with just a sole chunk of, most likely the most recently butchered meat, cooked to perfection on it. No garnish, no sides, just meat. Once sitting, Hunter quickly went to town on the steak. Hunter has been denying media interviews after chomping down at his steak, but told the National Post in a statement that he doesn't really know why he's being targeted because our identity as a restaurant is well known throughout the city, as is our ethical farming and foraging initiatives. One of the protesters said that their reason for targeting Antler was because it's a small business that uses ethical meat. The reason behind this is they think they have a better chance of getting action at a smaller restaurant rather than a chain, and the protesters don't believe in the concept of ethical meat. That concludes this week's edition of the Big Buck Registry's Deer News. For links to the stories featured this week, please check our show notes at www.bigbuckregistry.com. If you have any ideas for future topics or have any questions about any of these topics, please email me at jim@bigbuckregistry.com. For the Big Buck Registry, this is Jim Keller with the Deer News.
Thanks to Jim Keller for the Deer News. Without further ado, here is Joshua Franks. Bill, welcome back to the Big Buck Registry Deer Hunting Podcast. And Josh, welcome to the show. I'm glad to have both of you guys.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad to be here.
There's so many topics that you guys are covering over there at Pressure Deer Pros, and to me, this is like a mini series. You ever watch those mini series on television? Well, this is kind of what this is to me, because you guys are exploring some new ground, and I think it would be a disservice if I didn't explore exactly what you guys are doing, because I think it's cutting edge.
Gotcha. Yep.
Cool.
We totally agree.
So, Josh, I wanted to kind of get an understanding who you are, where you're from, and I'll talk to Bill a little bit and why he brought you into the circle of masters and Pressure Deer Pros to begin with. But tell me about your background. What does hunting mean to you?
My first recollection of hunting would have to be squirrel hunting, dove hunting with my dad. Mm-hmm. First shotgun I shot was a Sweet 16 Browning. Knocked me on my butt, got back up, and did it again. And then we got heavy into duck hunting because that's what my family did, big time ducks. And then my first deer I killed was an 8-point. And I remember we were sitting there, we're gutting him, and Dad was showing me how and everything. And then I was like, "Can I shoot him?" He's like, no, don't. So that's, that was the first time that I got my experience with, a big buck. And to this day, it was, massive. I don't really know if it was or not because it was so long ago. I mean, I was 10. I'm 33 now, but, 7 years old, started hunting. It's been there ever since. It's a passion. I got to do it. I don't feel right if I'm not out doing it. So.
Gotcha. Bill, why did you bring Josh into Pressure Deer Pros and your circle of masters?
Well, we met through a mutual friend named Michael Yates, another one of the masters. And I found Josh right off the bat to be very much an intellect, for his age, and also very dedicated to hunting. At the same time, he was a young Christian guy, and he's very interested in veterinary hunting, which is something I do. And so we kind of connected there. And then he was learning all this stuff offline about mapping and just doing a bunch of stuff that for a while I wondered, just how effective this stuff was going to be. But then Greg did some mapping, to be a fact, on a Missouri hunt that we went on, and that changed my whole outlook on what can be done with maps. Up until this point in time, say 3 years ago or something like that, I'd never used maps before.
Right.
I did everything boots on the ground. I mean, I had to see it with my own eyes. To me, the idea of looking at something from the air was just to get a general idea so you don't get lost. It wasn't anything to do with planning. And now, boy, I wished I'd have been doing it for a lot longer time, because I'm taking on a giant learning curve, because I had to start with some mapping books that are out there and just read general information just to catch up with Josh. And I still haven't caught him. So real good at mapping. He's put several clients this year right on top of deer. We've had deer die because of his Cybro scouting and lots of close calls. I came close a few times using Josh as a medium to go in between on some properties I was hunting for and things like that. So anyway, one of these days, he was talking to me about the sun and shade beds, and we got off onto that. And then the next thing I know, he's bombarding me with all this information, which is kind of my information regurgitated, if there's a better way to put it, but putting a twist on it from an angle that I'd never seen. The whole idea, the whole time, I thought we were kind of beating a dead horse here, because I'm thinking, how do you use it tactically? How do you use it tactically? And Josh is like, that'll come, Bill, let that go. But I'm a chess player. My mind is going tactical from, day one. I can't help it. But I had to get by that. And I had to do the earnest study. And that's why in our book that we've written, Temperature and Mature Buck Bedding, Volume 1, we're doing it in 3 volumes, and we're purposely separating them a year apart, because that's the minimum learning curve, in my opinion. You can absorb this information and then turn around and use it. And whereas I have not been directly successful, in other words, I can't tell you, I know I have in the past, I just didn't know it. But since I've been studying temperature and trying to use it to ambush a big buck, I've never killed one yet. But we've had 2 really good examples of guys that did, and they did so by using the information, that we give them. But this is a deadly concept. It shares the dynamic with the moon, and that is that both of these dynamics can be predicted ahead of time. Both the temperature flux, or, everything to do with the weather and stuff that we use, and how we use it to map where a whitetail can be on any given day. In other words, I still use all my rutting tactics, but, there's a time when the rut winds down and it goes back to bedding and feeding, and you're going to get him pretty much off that, and the more you know about bedding, the more you have a chance of finding the right bedding area and setting up and hunting all day and taking him out. Well, temperature, and because of wind direction and everything that's in this book, starts narrowing it down big time as to where this buck can be, where he will be, or where he's going to be. And here's the catch. By close examination of all these variables and looking at it, from the angle of the intellect, which is really our only advantage over instinct, I'd like to introduce to everybody Josh Franks, our master when it comes to dealing with mapping or cyber work, and our temperature guy.
Very good. All right, Josh. So tell me why we should cyber scout as a deer hunter, and what do I need to know about buck temperature bedding?
Cyber scouting can help you pick up on things that, how do we say it? Let's just say little subtle changes, funnels, bedding points, travel areas, just all kinds of different things that you can map ahead of time. You can go look at these things and check these out. That way you're not, okay, here, this looks good, I'm going to pop up a stand. And if you continue to do that, it's going to take you a lot longer to learn an area to where you can go in and say, hey, I'm going to look at this, and this, and this is where the bucks should bed. This is where they should be forced to travel. Let's go check it out and see what it looks like. And then temperature bedding is a way to look at your bedding areas based on weather conditions for a day and see which ones are the best for a hot time frame, a cold time frame, or that temperature flux that we were talking about.
What did we do before we had cyber scouting? I mean, there was a day when Google didn't exist.
No matter where you go in, let's say up north, Midwest, down south, wherever, bucks tend to bed in the same places. It just might be subtle changes from region to region and how they do, how they bed and how they do it. So it can get you on bucks a lot faster than just walking around. Let me find it. Let me continuously walk through here and leave my scent and bust deer all over the place. It's a big advantage.
Okay.
I'd like to just interject real quick here. Temperature, when we start talking about the elevation variables, they do exist in flat country, but to a less degree. But then when they do use them, they'll really use them. All right. And then let's say, okay, in hilly country, different variables are going to play a role in all this. So it really depends on your terrain. But see, the better you know said terrain, however long you've been hunting on the property, temperature will make perfect sense to you, because you're going to be able to look at your property and say, now, wait a minute, the sun shines over here all day in this northeast corner, and they've got cover for the northwest wind to come up there. That's an ideal spot.
All right, let's talk about sun and shade. You guys are talking about temperature. You're talking about bedding areas and a buck bed. How does the sun and the shade affect where a buck is going to lay down?
Well, it depends on time of year. Let's say it's 80, 89, 92 down here in Tennessee. Around that time, it can push anywhere from 105 to 110 heat index. So it gets pretty rough. One of the places that really we involved in our study was a place that I used to could hunt, and checked it out on the map. A bachelor group had been there for the last 10 years, and I had went in there and actually blew a nice 4.5-year-old out of there with some younger bucks. So when Bill found sun to be just an absolute thing, I said, okay, well, let me look on this map where I know these bucks have been bedding year after year in the summer. Let's see how much shade affects them. And sure enough, on the map, it was a shade spot. Now, I can't give you my secret to that, but it hit home. It's like, hey, these bucks are here every year during the summer and early part of the season. But as soon as leaf drop would hit and the rays would get in there, those bucks would leave. So hot time of year, let's say you're in the ridges, the better elevation change that you have there, lining up with your most predominant winds, south, southwest, southeast, whichever it is, and the deeper the shade, the better chances you are going to have a buck laying there. And if you jump to wintertime frame, buck's not going to want to lay in any kind of shade when the high is 42. So the power of the sun and him being able to sit there, get out of the wind, get into the sun and warm his body up is huge for him. So it's big time when you come to look at buck beds and time of year and different variables. You start playing with those variables, it starts shifting that bedding to all of a sudden let's have full on shade to full on sun and things like that.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. That makes total sense to me. I mean, these animals are temperature driven. You always hear about the buck that has a heavy coat in the middle of the winter towards the end. Then if it's abnormally hot day, you don't expect them to move. And I assume that this is something similar to that.
It's not, and that's something I've had to get Bill out of. He's all about the moon, all about this movement. I'm like, no, I'm not looking at movement. I'm looking at bedding. What makes them bed, where, when, and why? It's like a guy we have involved with our study named Joe Elsinger. He called me up. He said, hey, man, I found this great spot. I can't remember if he found a dead buck skull or he jumped a big one out of there. But he said, I believe this is going to be a great spot for early time of year. I'm going to hang my camera. It's on public land. Let's see what happens. So then he sends a scroll of pictures, and first couple of pictures were some young bucks laying there, and you could see, some shade spots, some sun spots. And then you could see a flat spot right in the middle of the picture, and there was a sun on it. And then one day when it got to its darkest, this good deer, probably, I don't know, I'm bad at judging when they're in velvet, but I'm going to say he's somewhere around 150, come in and laid down right there in what you could see was the flat spot at the darkest time of the day. And then as it started to lighten up, that buck got up, smelled around, and left. And on the pictures, you can see the deer avoid the sun on that ridge. So it was really interesting to see that happen. But it's one of those things that when we tell people, it's like, okay, there are places on your property that are cooler. There are places on your property that are warmer, that act like heaters, and the cool places act like refrigerators. The bucks know where these places are. And if they line up correctly with everything else the buck wants, that's where he's going to bed. And that's where you should check on your really cold days or your really hot days.
Right. All right. It's simple, but often overlooked, I think.
Big time.
Okay.
Yep.
Very good. What about clouds? How do clouds mix in to this strategy?
It can change everything. What we've seen with clouds is you'll have a front either coming in or leaving, and a lot of times you've got moisture associated with that. I'm going to jump on the winter time frame. So when that happens, a lot of the times when it's cold and you've got a moist wind, those bucks tend to go towards a thermal cover. Looking at, say, 5 to 10 foot high pines, cedars, real heavy brush around it, or just heavy brush period, where they can get out of that and get in that cover to kind of get moisture in the wind off them, is what we've seen so far. Another thing, Bill jumped. He said, I could have just walked up and grabbed him, but he said it was a 160-inch deer on a rainy day that was in a cedar thicket, just lay there dead asleep. He said, I like to scare him to death, So it really changes how these deer would normally bed, they want to get in that cover to stay dry and get out of that moisture and change the effects. There's a lot more with clouds we need to look at, but those are the effects that we see so far, is that they tend to prefer a thermal cover to where they can get out of whatever kind of moisture, whether it's snow, rain, a moist wind, whatever, they can get out of that.
I can see evidence of that, like just looking at bedding areas and swamps. Like they'll go through the swamp, but they're going to lay on the dry spot. Interesting.
Unless you flip towards a hot time of year, and then they're gonna look at some moist ground.
Correct. Yeah.
At that time.
That's a good point. It's a very good point. All right. So wherever you live, no matter it's north, south, east, west, doesn't matter. There are temperature fluxes that occur throughout the seasons that are unseasonably odd, whether it's extreme colds in some of the warmer times or some extreme temperature during what you would expect to be hot. How do you assess that in this plan?
I guess the first thing that I would tell people is you have different fluxes everywhere you go, and you have different, deer look at wind differently in Kansas than they do down in Tennessee, and deer look at snow differently in Tennessee than they do in Michigan. So everything's a little different everywhere you go, but there's some base models to everything that will help you figure out your area and how your deer will operate with temperature and how they'll try to relieve themselves of whatever conditions going on. But here in Tennessee, starting, let's say, the end of October and then into November, you're going to start getting some cool nights and some warm days. So a lot of times the flux will occur here, let's say 42 low, and you might be 65, by 10:30, 11 o'clock. So a lot of times what we've seen is the buck will want to bed for sun early in the morning. Well, he doesn't know that warming trend is going to come and hit him, and all of a sudden he's too hot. He needs to do something. If he feels comfortable about switching, he will shift out of that sun bed and go to the closest spot that he can get in the shade and get out of those direct rays. A lot of times what I find in ridges, I'll look at horseshoes, oak leaves, or a cluster of points so that you can get a lot of those sun and shade angles within those close proximities. And if the buck, like I said, feels unpressured, he'll get up and he'll move to one of those areas that he can get that shade and get out of that hot sun.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and then, we have Joe's been big on pictures, so I gotta shout him out, but he had a flux to where a front come in and the buck was used to it being warm. So he went and bedded in a bed that was shade, bare dirt bed under cedar. But it only reached 60 degrees, and the buck got up and left at noon and went 100 yards on public land to a more open, sunlit area. That way he could take advantage of the sun hitting him, because there again, too, at 60 degrees, he also had a 20-plus mile-an-hour wind. So that was really starting to affect that buck laying in that shade. He didn't like it, so he got up and left and moved and went 100 yards. And that's that tactic that Bill was talking about earlier. That's a 100-yard move. If you can look ahead and see that move and kind of know how that buck's going to make that move, that's a dead buck.
Right. Okay. So when you guys are out in the field, I mean, are you assessing this stuff on the fly kind of thing? Like, hey, these are the temperature conditions. We get a front coming in at this time. I need to be at this spot, X, Y, Z.
The biggest thing that you look at is, where's the buck bedded? Let's say he's bedded in a swamp. We've found that wind can really affect a buck in the cold time of year. So if there's not a good windbreak there to help that buck out in that swamp, and he's not extremely pressured outside of there, we're going to kind of look at that area as, well, this may be a straight sun area. And if it starts to get windy and cold, or cloudy and cold with some wind, it might be something that we want to look at this buck leaving this area, when it's windy. You go to a straight hardwood ridge. Let's say it's you've got a lot of white oaks, red oaks, things like that, and it's just a bed on top of the ridge. There's no midline bed where you've got a flat spot, halfway down where he can get up against that ridge to block anything. That might be more of a early season high wind kind of day, instead of early season hot where there's no wind.
Okay.
Type thing. So there's a lot of different things that we look at and play, and then we don't just guess. We kind of put the cameras up and say, hey, let's figure out what's going on for sure.
All right. So you're testing a hypothesis. You're exploring with cameras and field checks, it sounds like, and then
Correct.
Seeing if you're right. And if you're right, you put that in the memory banks for another day. Say, hey, you know what? I called this because of X, Y, and Z conditions, and I nailed it. I nailed it this time.
Yeah, and I incorporate a lot of this stuff into my mapping with customers too, and I've helped some people kill, and then I've had some people say, well, I didn't quite get there, and I wish I would have, because there was 3 bucks went right through there where you told me they was going to. And I was like, dang, I hate that for you, but glad I was right,
Right. Okay.
So.
All right. You've talked about some surface area and elevation changes. What does that mean?
The surface area, you can take that really anywhere. When you're in ridges, what I like to see when I'm scouting a bedding area is I like to see a lower bed, a mid-level bed, and I like to see bedding on top, of course. The more that the buck has different levels to bed at, he can adjust for whatever conditions may be thrown at him within that bedding area in the ridge scenario.
Okay.
And then if you look at swamps, a lot of times early season, you're going to be looking at somewhere where he can get in the shade and find that cool ground. Well, cool ground don't always play effect if you've got a higher wind, so he might shift to a slight rise within the same area and sit there on that rise. But a lot of that swamp is covered with water, and he's not going to lay directly in water or mud, so it takes a lot of stuff out that you have to look for. And then same thing with ridges. They're not going to be just anywhere. They're going to be on those points, and if those points don't have enough surface area in where they want to lay, then they won't be there.
Gotcha.
Make sense?
Yes. Okay. All right. So the surface area is an adequate amount of space.
Right. When you go where I live, you don't have as much. Everything kind of rolls a lot slower where I live, to where if you go, east of here, you start getting into mountains and things like that. So the bedding is more forced.
Right.
So when you talk about surface area, you look at how much area the buck has to actually lay on versus a forced situation where he has to lay there or lay at another spot.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Very good. You talked a little bit about cooler ground. Cooler ground, I would assume, would be an attractive spot for a buck at certain times.
Yep.
if you're out in the field, you're trying to assess that particular condition on that particular day, when should I be looking for this cooler ground that a buck might want to go to?
Well, the first obvious answer is early season. The second one would be whenever your stuff, your area, your weather stops fluxing. Like I said, I can flux from in October, 1st of November through the rest of the season. I may never stay a steady temperature, where as you go up to Bill, once it turns off cold, it's cold. And you go deep down south, and I'm sure they've got a lot of flux too. But you're looking for when it's going to be above average temperatures during the season, or hot time frame is what you're looking for. And we're still playing with cool ground in the swamps and stuff, because we kind of did some research, and ground can be 30 degrees cooler when it has water underneath it than the ground around it. So that can make a big temperature change. And it's just as simple as saying, hey, look at your dog in your backyard. How often does he dig down, to get to different ground temperature, clay, mud, stuff like that. So the attractiveness is to when it's hot and when the buck needs that coolness up against his body, because remember, they cannot regulate their body temperature. So there's different factors that we're looking at with temperature inside these bedding areas to help them get that regulation that they need for that day.
So unlike other animals that can regulate, you're saying that they're using the actual geothermals of the earth to help control their body temperature as needed.
That's what we're seeing.
Okay.
Yeah. I've had discussions with Joe. He's seen them on hot times laying in kind of a moist sand. I've found them bedding on the edge of beaver swamps in ground that's black as night, and when you touch it, it's cool, it's damp, and there's 5 or 6 large beds filled with hair right there. So their hot time frame, cool ground is a big attractant, especially when you have no wind, because once you get a wind, it kind of takes that cool ground. It kind of knocks it down a little bit, because they can get the wind up against them like a fan and help cool them down.
Yeah.
Well, air starts sinking when you got a lot of humidity. So they'll be lower in the best ground that they can find within that bedding area. And it may be something as simple as they're halfway down the ridge or lower, and they're on one of those shelves, that surface area that I was talking about, and the ground is a lot cooler down there, and the air is sinking to them too. So it helps them regulate that temperature and get that relief from that hot day.
Okay. Let's take a coffee break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Joshua Franks. How many of you have eaten a vine-ripened, juicy tomato picked fresh from the garden? How does that compare to the bland, pale, hard tomatoes that you've seen at the grocery store during the winter? No comparison, right? Well, if the coffee that you typically drink comes from a can or whatever was on sale that week, you owe it to yourself to give Hunter's Blend a try. Just like store-bought tomatoes don't hold a candle to the fresh ones from your garden, store-bought coffee doesn't hold a candle to select specialty-grown, fresh roasted coffee. Store-bought coffee, and most coffee for that matter, comes from cheap, inferior-grade coffee beans because they're cheaper. Farmers in Nicaragua and Thailand select their top beans, which are then purchased direct by the folks at Hunter's Blend Coffee, where they custom roast beans in their Central Ohio roastery to produce a premium-grade coffee. Just like that first bite of a ripe, juicy tomato, one sip of fresh brewed Hunter's Blend coffee is all that it will take for you to realize that you've never really had coffee until now. Go to huntersblendcoffee.com to order some today. And as always, let your local hunting store know about Hunter's Blend Coffee so they can carry it in their store. Hunter's Blend Coffee. We're hunters too. And now back to our conversation with Joshua Franks. Speaking of humidity, that makes me think of moisture, right?
Yep.
And you and I have had this conversation a while back about moisture in beds in particular and how that affects their decisions on where they're going to go and when they're going to move. Let's talk to me about this moisture that you've been studying. This is one of the pieces of this whole thing that kind of fascinates me, because you don't ever, I don't think I would have ever thought about this until you said it to me that one day.
Well, the big thing, like I said, that we've seen is them wanting that cool ground in the hot time to escape, the heat. They want moisture during the early part of the season. But it seems like once you flip that switch and you're starting to get cold, they don't want that moisture on them anymore. They don't want it at all. Like I was telling you that one day that it was 18 degrees here. The wind was 14 out of the northeast, and the humidity was 63%. Well, it made it feel like it was 1 degrees that day.
Mm-hmm.
So when you think about a buck, let's say he goes and lays down. He's been traveling. He's got a little moisture on his body. He's not going to want to be in that wind that makes it feel like it's 1 degrees. So he's going to bed somewhere that he can get in the sun, he can get out of the wind, and in a drier soil to help him out there.
Okay.
So that way he's not, continuously forming a layer of moisture underneath him too. Because the longer you sit there in that moisture and continuously forming it, it's going to make you colder and damper and wetter, and you're just going to feel miserable.
Yeah. And like any moisture, like wet clothing, for example, if you go hiking.
Yeah, well, I used to, when I'm duck hunting, I've got waders on.
Yeah.
And, you may not be doing much of nothing. You're standing there, but you can still be wet. You'll take your waders off, you're wet. You ain't got no leak or nothing. You were forming moisture from that. I've even sat on ground that really wasn't wet. I get up and I'm soaked.
Right.
Why? Because I was drawing that moisture out of that ground.
Right. And moisture in and of itself, or just wetness, right, will deplete you of heat. It's a great thermal transfer. It'll suck you dry. It'll make you.
And Bill can, he can enlighten you on that latent heat evaporation.
Yep.
Bill, I still haven't sat down and read it because I've got so many different things going through my head with the other stuff. He was the one that kind of jumped on that, and the cooling process and the drying process and all that with latent heat evaporation that goes on with that.
Okay. We'll tap into Bill's brain there in a little bit and talk about that. So wind, what should I be thinking about when it comes to wind? I'm out, it's a windy day or complete lack of wind. I mean, that's got to affect things.
It is. And, and it goes back to time frame. Is it hot outside? So if it's hot and windy, you're going to be looking at the buck being on a higher elevation, and like Bill was saying, it may not be that much of a change that you can notice it in flat ground, but it's enough that he's catching that extra wind in that swamp. Or in ridges, he'll be on top or a lot higher than what he normally would be because he's getting that relief from that wind. And we actually had one of our guys one day go in and jump a bachelor group, no wind, hot, and they were low on the ridge in some bare dirt beds again. He come back a couple weeks later. It was about the same temperature, but it was, I think, 12 or 15 mile an hour wind, and they were, I think, 50 yards higher on the ridge. So it changes the position. It may not change it, drastically, but it will change the elevation height. And then if you look at it during a winter time frame, it could change it drastically depending on, other variables there. Is there sun? Is there not? Different things like that. So it can really change it a lot on where they bed for the day.
Gotcha. Let's talk about Joe's buck for a little bit. We had talked a little bit about Joe's buck before we started recording here, but it's an interesting story.
Joe is a public land hunter out of Iowa. I noticed Joe on a forum starting to talk about seeing things, deer bedding differently because of different weather factors. I was like, oh crap, he's gonna figure it out. Let me message him and see if he wants to join the study.
Yeah.
Because I don't want this getting out right now because I feel like we're on something big here. And told Joe what was going on, what we had been looking at. He was like, yes, I'd love to. So we get to talking and involve him in the study. And we were talking one day about leaf drop and sun rays and how much that would affect deer, on a warming trend day. Where would they go to get that shade? What would they do? And that's when we started looking at moisture in the ground and cool ground. And then it led to other things. But one day I was sitting there and Joe sent me the picture and I said, hey, that's nice. I said, did you kill him based on temperature? He said, I did. I said, cool. How did you do it? He said, well, you remember we were talking about leaf drop. He said, well, around here we'll get a lot of snow. And he said, I've noticed deer bedding in open canopy on south facing slopes. I said, okay, cool. He said, well, I knew one of my bedding areas really well, and I felt like I had a great chance to go in and shoot the buck. He said, because it was -2. He said, snow was all over the ground. He said, and I felt like there was a good spot there that the buck could get out of what little wind we had. He said he just come in and he smoked him. And he was, there again, he was, I don't know, 140-inch 8-point, real nice buck on public land in Iowa. So knowing what his deer, wanted to do and where he thought they would do it at led him to go kill that 8-point.
Gotcha. I mean, and you're talking about a little bit of wind on a very cold day means a big deal, as opposed to we're not talking about a lot of wind, but you're still understanding the temperature, the time of year, and what that buck is really seeking, especially relative to, in this case, wind. It's not like it's a hurricane blowing through. It's just enough for them to make a decision.
A little wind can affect them a lot, and what I was trying to say is, when you look at different weather factors from any region, they're going to adjust throughout the year depending on the situation, where whether it's hot and you want cool ground and some wind, or it's extremely cold and you want no wind and sun. It's like the guys up north, when they go cold, they stay cold, but then they get these massive fronts come in with a lot of wind, maybe a lot of snow, and a lot colder temperatures than what we have down here. So you might see those bucks do a temperature flux because of going from cold to extreme cold. And where would they do that at? So it's not always set in stone, the exact things that I see or that maybe Joe sees or somebody else sees. It's looking at the short list of variables that we have, looking at your weather and knowing your bedding areas, and see the variables that affect your deer and how and where and why.
Okay. All right. Very good.
Because not everybody's weather is going to be the same.
Gotcha. And Bill, there's also this other buck, the Bill Gibson buck, and I think it's a similar story. Can you tell me about the aspects of the Bill Gibson buck and what that means to this whole idea?
Yeah. This is at least a 4.5-year-old Michigan deer, and I think he was a bit older than that. And basically, this deer was living on an island in the middle of a cattail marsh that was surrounded by water. And on Christmas Eve, when the buck showed up there to bed down, there was zero wind practically. If there was any at all, it was a warm wind because it was warm out. It was above 40s, and it had been warm for quite a little snap. So I think the buck had been going to that spot regularly and feeding in this nearby standing cornfield. He was using an oak ridge to transition between these two spots. Now, we had a camera there for over a year since we found out about him. And the last I knew, other than the last I knew after that, we had never had a picture of him during the day. And we never did get a broad daylight picture of him. But I guess right there near the time that he'd gotten ready to try for him late season there, he had got one clip of him in enough, shooting light to say, hey, it was legal shooting light. So he was ready to try anyway. But on that particular day, I started looking at the conditions, and Rick had told me, because he plows snow, Rick had told me, hey, we got some really rough stuff headed our way. And what it was is that we had a precipitation front coming in that was going to be heavy with wet snow. Okay, and I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of what latent heat of evaporation is. If somebody wants to look that up, it's an engineering term, but basically what it means, it's why you feel cold when you get right out of a fresh shower and while you're drying off. The process of evaporation, water evaporating off your body causes you to feel cold. Now, if you were to stand someplace and have an oscillating fan and an oscillating sprinkler, to where, okay, you get hit with the sprinkler, then you get hit with the fan, and you were standing there naked, it would not take long for you to be very uncomfortable, to make my point.
Right.
Okay, so this is basically what the buck was going through on this island, because by later in that day, the wind had picked up and the temperature had dropped enough to where now the storm front, which a lot of people might say, oh, the barometer. Well, we had tons of times where we had the barometer come in when that buck was there, and the barometer moved and he didn't move. So here we go. Was it the barometer? Well, it definitely plays a role. We know that. But in this particular case, these Michigan bucks that are living in places to where basically, I have no other way to put this, that if he leaves that bed, what happened to him is why he don't leave it. Because there's always somebody laying for him. So anyway, we had the stand placed perfect. We were blowing across an area where the buck would have had to expose himself in order to scent check it. So therefore, his travel was forced up the inside edge of the woods where he could watch for that. And by 4 o'clock, Bill jumped on stand, and now it had turned over to completely wet snow. And the temperature was dropping even further, and the winds were now, I believe, in excess of 30 mile an hour. And basically, put it in layman's term, that big buck got blowed right off that island. And when he did, he followed his normal trail that was normally in the dark during the day, because basically he was forced to, and Bill shot the buck at 12 yards with his bow and arrow. And in Michigan, I mean, around here in Calhoun County, and I was at his house 15 minutes after dark checking that buck out. So, I mean, it's legitimate, and the guy's character's without question anyway, but it just made me feel good to see that come together. And I was able to see it coming together a couple of days ahead of time, because I was already going to suggest to Bill that he hunt that night, because that was the night that the moon was going to be in the perfect position, I think about an hour and a half before dark. So I was already hoping the moon would pull him off, but it hadn't before, unless he went the other way. But anyway, it's all immaterial. Bill shot and killed the buck, and it was because these things lined up, in other words. So by looking at where the buck's going to bed in the morning, and decide if where he's going to bed in the morning due to those conditions is going to fluctuate to where he needs to be in a different spot. If you're at that different spot and can foretell it ahead of time, which I can just give away one real quick ambush trick. If a buck in ridge country is bedded on a point facing the south, to get all day sun and to be out of the cold with the northwest wind, in other words, got the crest behind him to block the wind, and suddenly the wind switches to the south, the buck is faced with a problem. Now, it could be solved with him simply getting up from one side of the bush and walking to the other and lay back down and put his back to that, but then he's going against what his instinct wants to do as far as the direction he wants to be able to face and be able to watch. So basically what he does is by looking at where at the time that this condition would take place, the wind change would take place, you'd know on the north side of the slope, he's going to want to go over there to get out of the wind. But what's going to be rare on the north side? A sunspot.
Right.
So if you can find a sunspot on the north side, there is a good chance that he might accidentally find that, if you know what I mean.
Well, and I think the biggest thing that people need to know about Joe's book, like you said, it was sunny, it was mid-20s, no wind, and those conditions changed because we talked about water being underground can be a lot cooler, and then he started getting pelted with wind and snow, clouds, all that stuff, and he left, to leave a secure area. He left to venture out and try to find him somewhere that could get him out of that storm that was pounding him.
Right. Gotcha.
Sometimes it's real obvious. Like, for instance, you can say to yourself, you can set it up ahead of time. So you're scouting around, and you notice that there's really no place for them to effectively beat the heat here. But right over here, there's a real effective place for them to beat it. And we just so happen to have a pinch point in between. It's an automatic setup. And you can set up for the temperature flux. But that's not really what we're trying to do. Because I'm not trying to bring ambush even into it yet. I'm just saying that there are a lot of different ways.
All right. So talking about cyber scouting, talking about bedding, moisture in beds, talking about all those things that we've just talked about. If I'm thinking about early season, I mean, because you got to put this in perspective, right? You got to make this like real life.
Right.
If you talk about what should I be thinking about early season in general that would make me pinpoint certain areas?
So let's say I have a north-facing slope. I have good cover on top of the ridge for the buck, and my wind is going to be some form of south. So I want to kind of nail that down, and I want to see if there's plenty of places for that buck to lay, and I want to make sure that he's going to have adequate shade, early season right there. And then the surface area, putting that in there is going to allow that buck to be there on more than one occasion. So biggest thing you're looking for is I always equate pressure in there. If there's pressure and people are hunting it, you might as well just exit off the map. But if it lines up with my winds, it's got good cover or blow down or some kind of scrub brush there on a ridge, and he's got plenty of places to lay to adjust, and he's got good visibility with his eyes out front, then there's a good chance that he's going to be there during the hot time frame of the year to lay there.
Okay. Gotcha. All right. And let's reverse that now. Let's go late season.
Depends on where you're at. Let's just say you're up north. You're going to want to look for a south-facing slope, somewhere that's going to allow a lot of sunlight, some good ground cover for the buck to land, but you still want to be able to see out front good. And then being up north, I want to have the ability to block some kind of wind, whether it's the ridge itself, thick, heavy brush behind him, cedars, pines, something to that effect. I'm wanting that back there. And that helps on him picking up noise from anything coming from behind him too, but it also really helps in knocking that wind down, because I've sat in cedars and pines before on a cold, windy day, and it helped me tremendously. I don't know if you've ever done that yourself, but a buck laying there wants a lot of sun and wants some kind of wind relief, so he's not sitting there getting blasted by that cold wind.
Absolutely. It's 10 degrees. It's blowing wind like it's out of the northern hemisphere. And I'm looking for a little sun, and I'm looking for a little windbreak somewhere.
Yeah, and that's the biggest thing that I think people got to remember is these bucks live out there 365 days a year.
Right.
They know where it's the coolest. They know where it's the warmest. They know where they can take advantage of all these factors that we're telling you about, because they can't just walk in and turn their heater on or air conditioning or whatever. They can't get out of the rain. They can't do none of that. So they know where to take advantage of these different weather factors in these bedding areas to help them get relief from whatever may be going on.
Right. Okay. All right. So all this stuff that we're talking about is great. Definitely happens all the time. But what happens, and this is kind of when they're just doing their thing, not being bothered too much. What happens when you apply pressure? What happens when you have guys coming in and hunt these places? How does that change all that?
It can make a great spot that could have everything that you want be void, pretty much. And it's not out of the realm of possibility if a buck gets caught in a situation that he may lay in something that's just not suitable for the day, but he felt too pressured to leave that area. And that's the whole concept of us looking at everything that we're looking at is to kind of X out those places that are pressured, number one, find the areas that are best with temperature, and then hopefully find good consistency there for everybody with that. Because if you're constantly busting an area, he's not going to lay there. He's going to find the areas that you're not or somebody else is not, and that's where they're going to bed. And the areas that have the best relief for any kind of weather situation will be the most consistent areas that you find.
Gotcha. Okay.
So pressure bad.
Pressure is
Stay
bad.
away from it.
Yeah. So take all this stuff, throw it out the window. None of it. Well, not that none of it applies, but certainly adds a.
No,
whole
I mean,
element.
if you've got a bunch of people pounding some spots that you found, you might as well just not even go back to them,
right?
Because they're not going to be there at all.
If people are just brand new to this, I'm a little overwhelmed, and I know that we haven't really even gone deep on this stuff yet. We just kind of touched the surface. So give me 2 pieces of something that I can use with this information that I can apply immediately when I go in the woods.
If it's hot, look for a shaded bedding area. If it's cold, look for a sunny bedding area. But like I said, we can get deeper on that and go into a lot of different variables, and it all starts changing. But those are the 2 best information that I can give you is shade and sun. If it's hot, go shade. If it's cold, look for sun.
That's a good, quick summary without getting into all these little nitty-gritty details that I can take home. That's very good. Thank you very much. Josh, let's get into the 10 rapid-fire questions here.
All right.
What's your number 1 hunting tip of all time?
My number 1 hunting tip of all time, I guess, really would be, if you're deer hunting, hunt the bedding areas. Don't, because I wasted a lot of time in my younger years hoping, waiting, go out, do your scouting, find the buck beds. Don't, I hear so many people say right place, right time. No, if I could change my answer for my pet peeve, that's one of them. I can't stand that.
Sounds like you got a couple.
No.
Got a couple.
Yeah, it's right place, right time. No, it's not. The more work you put into it in finding where these bucks bed and what they want to do, the more you'll get out of it. Because I couldn't tell you how many hours I wasted in the stand just hoping, waiting for right place, right time, and it never happened.
Right. Very good. We all have these things that we love to hunt with. Like sometimes it's a little trinket or there's something we just feel like gives us a little bit of luck in the field and drives us crazy if we don't have it with us. Do you have something like that you need to have with you at all times?
I really don't.
Okay.
I've never been like that. I don't know.
Okay.
I've never found anything that I hunt that I've got to have this with me. No.
Okay. All right. Very good. What's your biggest pet peeve in life?
I guess people not listening to me, I guess, is the biggest pet peeve. They're looking at you, but they don't hear anything you're saying. They're like, "What? What'd you say?" I'm like, that's probably my biggest, yeah.
Because they're looking at their phone, right?
Or just staring at me and not really paying attention to anything I'm saying.
I hear you. That does happen. All right. Yep. How old are you today, Josh?
33.
33. What would you tell the 16-year-old Josh Franks, knowing what you know today?
Study harder. Have more patience.
Gotcha. Very good. All right. You're at a hunting convention somewhere in the world, and a stranger comes up to you and asks you what you do for a living. What do you say?
I work at Waste Management, and on the side, I am a whitetail consultant.
Very good. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
I had leftover chicken and noodles from a sushi restaurant.
All right. That sounds
good. I can't. Most of the time, I can't do breakfast food. I would rather get up and eat a steak or a bowl of chili or something. Everybody thinks I'm weird like that, but I'd rather have supper for breakfast, to be honest with you.
All good, man. I'm not holding that against you. All right. You get your own billboard on the side of a highway. It starts as a blank canvas. You can put anything you want on it. What would it say?
Oh, Lord. I would talk about our new website, Pressure Deer Pros. I would talk about the new book and just tell them to come check it out. Come check out the website and, see if we can't help you be a better hunter.
Gotcha. All right. If I say the word successful to you, who's the first person that pops into your head and why?
That would be my dad. He is a type A person, and he has worked himself to the bone to get to where he's at. So that would be the first person that comes to my mind. Just his work ethic and what type of person he is, and how he molded me to be a better man and father and things like that.
Yep. Okay. Very good. What's a typical day in your life look like?
I am a single full-time father of 3 kids, so it's very hectic. Wake up, go to work. Mom is helping me out right now until I find a babysitter.
Gotcha.
Gotta find one of those, but get home. If I have any customers to deal with, I try to talk to them and fix supper and do baths and homework and all that stuff at the same time. And then we go to bed and get up and do it all over again.
Gotcha. Very good. All right. And then what's a typical deer hunting day in your life look like?
I am looking ahead. I'm trying to keep track of weather and things like that. And I'm looking ahead, 3 days before I hunt. And I'm looking at that day, so I'm kind of thinking on where I want to be ahead of time and where the bucks might have already been bedding based on what weather is doing. So from there, I go off of sightings and pictures and all that stuff and wrap it all together and go with whatever the weather is telling me it's going to do.
Gotcha. Very good. All right, so we talked about pressuredeerpro.com. That's the website. You can go and get more information. But you and Bill wrote this book, and you mentioned it just a few minutes ago. Tell us more about the book. Where can we go get it, and when is it going to be available?
You can get the book at pressuredeerpros.com. The name is Temperature and Mature Buck Bedding. We are in the final stages right now putting it together, so hopefully it should be available within the week. Now, we're not going to have a paperback copy just yet. We're going to do a e-version, and then here in the near future, we're going to do a hard copy, paperback, whatever you want to say, that we can sell.
The paper version, but the e-book first, and then paper version will be available at another time.
Right.
Very cool, man. Josh, I got to tell you, man, it's really been a pleasure talking to you, and you're breaking down some subject matters that I think, all this stuff deserves more thought, and you guys are out there thinking about this stuff, and really, not only are you thinking about it, you're coming up with these theories, and then you're testing it, and you're coming back and saying, yeah, this was right, this was wrong, and then you're sharing it with everybody, which is extremely generous to me. A lot of guys would just keep it to themselves. So I appreciate everything you guys are doing.
Well, we appreciate you letting us come on, and my time is hectic, and I know there's a lot of people across America that love to hunt, want to shoot a big buck, and they've got kids and wives and jobs and all other kind of stuff going on. And what I would tell them is just take some time, read the book, start thinking about past where he's bedding, think about why, think about when, think about timing, and do study first. Study it, get all that stuff together, and then start going out and executing. Don't think you have to have all the answers right now. Don't even really think you have to hunt. Find those spots and start thinking about things differently, and it might put you in a lot more situations around those big bucks that you want to kill, and you might find out that you might cut your time down a lot when you start doing that.
Right, and we all have just so much time to give, so I'm with you. I think efficiency is nice.
It is. I had a customer say, hey, this is what's going on. These are the variables. Where would you hunt? Kind of X on the map type deal. I said, well, right here. Second day in, he killed a 148 net. So
awesome. Well, Josh, I appreciate it. Thanks for stepping in the studios with us.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you letting us come on.
I appreciate Josh coming on the show, and I appreciate Bill coming back on the show to introduce Josh. And these guys are, I think, are really cutting edge. So anything I can get out of Bill and his circle of masters and the Pressure Deer pros, I want to hear it. So we're going to continue on talking to as many of Bill's friends as we can. Dusty, do we have a Chubby Tines tip of the week this week?
Yeah, we do. And
the Chubby Tines tip of the week is sponsored by Morse's Sporting Goods. Firearms, used firearms, bows, used bows, located at 85 Kentucky Falls Road in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. Give Jim a call at 603-464-3444, morsessportinggoods.com. Your dollars go further in New Hampshire. There's no sales tax. Morse's Sporting Goods.
With covert joint on, it's time to talking a little bit about cameras and what you want to do with your cameras. And I tell you what, if you're not using trail cameras, you need to be. It educates you on what you deer do in the off season, and by understanding what their movement is now will play a huge role in up and coming months of whitetail deer hunting. You can focus on where they're pulling their most nutrition from as far as food source, where they're traveling to, where they're bedding at. And right now you can really get into an area and set up a few cameras and let it ride for a month or two. Most cameras now take 8 AA batteries, and man, they can really last for, you can put a 32 gig card in particularly, and really last for a long time in there and take a lot of pictures. And it's almost like your scout. Right now is the time to skin your scout in, to check out what you got coming far as contenders or players in the fall. So take advantage of right now to get out there and get them trail cameras up. The weather's starting to change. The battery life's going to be better. So use the spring here. Get your cameras out. Put them in places you normally wouldn't, and start monitoring your deer herd.
I think that's a great tip. And those coverts, man, I don't think I changed the batteries in my camera all winter. We had a slightly warmer February, but a lot of snow in February, and I think we had a overall very cold December and January. I still haven't changed the batteries from last year. That's crazy to me.
Yeah, for sure. And that's something that batteries are not cheap, and I'm not saying that I'm cheap, but man, I like to see something that gets a good life out of what I've purchased to put in it and use it for.
Yep, exactly. I hate to spend money when there's a technology that can help me just, not use as much energy. So.
Right. So yeah, you get a chance. You're looking for a camera. Mm-hmm. Go to www.dlccovertscoutingcameras.com and purchase your camera and let them know Big Buck Registry sent you over to pick them up.
Well, awesome. Thank you, sir, for coming up with another Chubby Times tip of the week. Man, it's been another fantastic show. Dusty, where can we find you when you're not hanging out here in the studios with me?
Shoot me an email, dusty@bigbuckregistry.com. You can look me up on Instagram and Twitter @ChasingAntler, Facebook.com/Chubby Times Outdoors. Jay, where can the people reach out to you when you're not on the mic?
Likewise, you can shoot me an email, jay@bigbuckregistry.com, and you can visit us on Facebook, facebook.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Twitter, which is twitter.com/bigbuckregistry. We're also on Instagram, instagram.com/bigbuckregistry, and YouTube, which is youtube.com/bigbuckregistry. On YouTube, you can listen to all of our podcasts in their entirety. As far as videos are concerned, it's a boring video, but the audio content is there, so you can actually listen to our podcast. You can also listen to all of our live shows that we've done on Thursday nights when we do them, and we've gone back and re-interviewed a lot of our previous guests we had on the show just to put a face to a voice, let's put it that way. You can always listen to our show on other places as well, not just YouTube. We're found on Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Google Play, and as an Amazon Alexa skill. Go to Alexa and say, Alexa, enable Big Buck Registry. And if you would like to submit a buck to our page for consideration and be featured on our page in front of 250,000 diehard deer hunting fans, all you have to do is go to bigbuckregistry.com/mybuck, and all of the instructions will be right there. I think that's pretty much everywhere we're at. I think that's a wrap, Dusty.
That's a whole lot of big buck, Jay.
Sure is. I'm Jay Scott.
I'm Dusty Phillips.
And this is the Big Buck Registry's Deer Hunting Podcast. We'll see you next week.